The Japan Self-Defense Force, or Japanese Self-Defense Force, or just the JSDF for short, serves as Japan's military force, but with a few key restrictions. None of these restrictions come in the form of technology or machinery, though, so we'll be looking at the JSDF from its inception post-World War II to its modern-day configuration and everything in between. That's right, it's JSDF month, baby. Now, I gotta hit my credits here at the top, but instead of going line by line, feel free to pause the video and take a deeper dive. All of these are great resources, and especially the YouTubers down there at the bottom. But I mention them specifically because there are a few particular videos, if you're interested in this topic, I think you would get a lot out of. So instead of a longer credit section, I wanted to recommend a few specific videos on the topic. And if you've not checked out these channels, they're also really great just in general. So of course we have the Cold Wars video, which is a good background on the early days of post-World War II Japan and how the JSDF gets its start. Then you have Perun's video, which is a great slideshow on the modern JSDF, and then Battle Order dives a little bit deeper to take a look at the rapid deployment forces within the JSDF, which are fairly new. So depending on how granular or how 1,000-foot view you want to get, you've got some options on the JSDF. So why talk about the JSDF? I mean, I'm not Japanese, I've never been to Japan, and I have no Japanese lineage. Well, outside of being a Gundam head and a weeb, the JSDF is tasked with protecting its country while being very near one of the most hostile regions in the world at the moment. Now, of course, topping the list of hostile neighbors is North Korea. Sure, here in the States, we really only regularly see headlines of missile launches or fairly mid-James Franco films. But for the people of Japan, this is a very real threat and a fairly common one. Even if not intentional, a failed calculation or mechanical malfunction could put one of these missiles that typically soars over Japan in Japan, or at least their territorial waters. Now, of course, by extension, the US and South Korea would likely be pulled into a conflict there as well. China, of course, poses another big threat in the region, but usually chooses to play its hand in a more economic or political sphere as opposed to a military one. Still a real threat, but less likely to accidentally land a missile in Japan. They also share a storied past with the Russians. In case you didn't know, Russia is stupid large. It's a big old boy. Last but most definitely not least, though, Japan punches well above its weight in the naval sector, putting it on par with pretty much every one of these contentious neighbors. Being an isolated island nation will kind of do that to you. And you'd expect this long tradition of naval excellence to come courtesy of another isolated nation island. So what am I going to talk about specifically? Well, we've got to start with a little history and the larger context of Japan's post-World War II military situation. Then we'll look at the overall budget and rough estimates of military personnel, dive a little deeper in there, take a look at the different branches, their makeup, and some notable pieces of equipment. And then we'll look at the possible operational areas for the JSDF as well as my personal thoughts. So the JSDF is pretty young in the grand scheme of things, in terms of Japanese history at least. Only getting its start back in 1954 on July 1st, which is when this video comes out, so happy birthday to the JSDF. This would have been a more fitting video to make on the 70th birthday instead of the 69th, which is purely accidental. But I didn't want to wait a year to talk about it, so here we are. Maybe I'll do a follow-up in a year, but this is kind of where we are. Now, the JSDF of today did have a predecessor in the National Police Reserve, which was less of a military force, but more of kind of like a national police force, if you will. But it was established back in 1952, and within the context of the Korean War, and much more in the term of a home guard than a more expeditionary military force. There was some resistance to this idea, and there's still resistance to certain paths that the JSDF can follow today, but with the withdrawal of some US troops to aid in the Korean War, the populace of Japan agreed something needed to be done. They needed at least a relatively small force just in case. Now, I'll talk about it more later, but the JSDF is actually pretty unique in terms of the military world when it's put in the context of its populace's proclivity towards pacifism. Now, the JSDF currently has around 250,000 active personnel with just over 50,000 reservists. They do not have mandatory or compulsory service, so they don't have a large base of people to pull from. While not the largest army in the area, with South Korea, North Korea, and China well overshadowing it, it does have a lot going for it. And something to kind of compare it to would be a similar sized population of Mexico. And it's relatively similar. Of course, in order to pay all of these people and pay for the equipment and maintenance, you need money. And in Japan's case, their last fiscal year, 21 to 22, with, of course, the kind of leftover maintenance fees from the previous year, comes in just under 6 trillion Japanese yen, or 1.22% of their overall GDP. Now, not a lot in terms of your overall GDP number, but for a country with no expeditionary drive, that's pretty good, especially considering NATO requires 2% from all of its member countries, and most of them don't meet it. So it's right in there, and with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they've put a little bit more money in there as well, with some interesting moves that I'll talk about in a little bit later and in separate videos. So what makes up the JSDF? Well, of course, we have their ground forces and the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force, their naval forces in the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, and lastly, their air force in the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. No space self-defense force as of yet, and I kind of included this slide for that joke a little bit, but you never know. Japan is always evolving their military, either through perceptions of a particular article or their actual equipment. So what do the ground forces of the JSDF look like? Well, with just over 150,000 members, the ground forces make up the majority of the overall forces in terms of manpower. Split into 10 different divisions across the home islands, with some variety like the 7th Armored Division, the ground forces of the JSDF are largely entirely purely set for defense. While it is true that there are some divisions with rapid response units centered around more amphibious operations, they're not entirely separate entities like the United States Marine Corps. They're designed to operate within the ground forces as a whole, since expeditionary operations really aren't that big of a focus for Japan. And this is really their first kind of testing of the waters, if you will, but it's more to reclaim islands that may have been taken, either because there's no personnel there, it's uninhabited, or it was taken over by a hostile force. While some criticism has been leveled at it, the JSDF is truly designed as a defense force, more so than a more formal military. This has been an ongoing internal conflict since the JSDF's inception back in the 1950s. I'll talk about it more in a moment, but this all centers around Article 9 of modern Japan's constitution, which has had more than a few different interpretations over the years. Now, most notable equipment of the JSDF's ground forces utilizes designs and is produced indigenously, which is actually pretty cool. For a fairly restricted market, Japan's defense industry has actually done fairly well for itself. For small arms, you're looking at Howa and their Type 89 and Type 20 assault rifles, while the Type 20 will eventually replace most of the Type 89s, at least for active service use. It has only started its full-scale production in 2020, so it's going to be a while. Now, moving on to armored vehicles, they have quite a few, as we see here, and for the most part, none of them are like licensed products. This is pretty much all indigenous, which is, once again, very cool for a country that doesn't allow for arms exporting, or at least up until fairly recently. So you couldn't sell these to anyone else. You couldn't really export them to anyone else. You couldn't even gift them. It was like, this is for Japan only, and Japan is not a big order typically. So the biggest kind of headline ones here are, of course, the new Type 10 tank and the Type 16 kind of mobile gun platform light tank type situation, which I'm going to talk about in a more in-depth video a little bit later on in this month. But you also have like the Type 90 NBT, which is their older generation tank, but they're still largely in service. You also have a variety of IFVs and APCs that they use as well. I believe their rapid response forces also use some form of an LAV, but I'm not sure specifically, because it does look like the Marine Corps LAVs, so it might be just a licensed copy. But regardless, it is fairly interesting that all of this is pretty unique to Japan. And the Type 10 is supposed to be at least one of the most cutting-edge tanks out there, and the separation between main battle tank and light tank is a very interesting concept I'll talk about in that video. While the ground forces make up the biggest chunk of manpower, the Japanese maritime self-defense force isn't to be put to shame. From pseudo-carriers to submarines, Japan's naval power is well above its regional peers. Not only does the JMSDF have to patrol some of the most contested waters in the world, outside of the Black Sea at least, it also serves as part of a missile defense network. When you have a neighbor that hates the oceans as much as North Korea, you might want to be able to have some systems to intercept those missiles just in case. This is where the Aegis missile destroyers and the Aegis combat system come in. While there are several navies that utilize the Aegis combat system, Japan is currently the second largest fleet of Aegis-equipped ships, coming in behind the US Navy, which overshadows everyone since it's a US design. Now, of course, we can't forget about their submarine fleet as well, with the new Taigai class vessels coming online within the last year. This class will focus more so on staying submerged for longer and being quieter, and a very interesting way of doing so. Now, I've mentioned them before, but the Izumo-class ships are probably some of the most newsworthy in terms of recent news that you may have seen. But we also have several classes of Aegis missile destroyers, the Taigai-class sub, and the rather interesting-looking Mogami-class frigate. While they don't operate any super carriers, they are refitting the Izumo and Kaga to carry F-35Bs. Does this change how the JMSDF can operate in the future? Yes. But I think outside of these particular ships getting refitted and being able to carry these aircraft, and I'll talk about this more in a separate video, but it's a really interesting note, if you read between the lines, on how the bigwigs, either in the JMSDF or in their shipbuilding industry or in their military at large, are interpreting Article 9. Now, right along with the refits for the Izumo in the Kaga, we have the Taigai-class submarines to stretch the idea of defensive weapons once again. You see, being able to stay submerged is great for surveillance, but this is not purely a surveillance platform. Also being quieter and using, if I'm correct, purely lithium-ion batteries, or maybe lithium batteries, it's very, very quiet. So this is great for surveillance, but when you partner that with Japan purchasing Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are likely going to go on Aegis destroyers as well, but can be fitted, I believe, to most of their submarine fleet, you start to see maybe this is less of a defensive weapon, but defensive weapon is an interesting term in and of itself that, once again, I'll talk about in these other videos because all of them it pretty much applies to. Now, we can't forget about the aviation wing of the JMSDF. They're important too. Of course, the Izumo and Kaga will be seeing F-35Bs, but I think it's more important to look at maritime patrol aircraft since Japan is an island nation. They have a lot of maritime to patrol. The dumb joke, they have a lot of water to patrol. Of course, you have the trusty P-3 Orion, and then you, of course, have the P-1 from Kawasaki doing most of the heavy lifting. These are aircraft you'll typically see, or at least complements to or contemporaries of, in most island or large coastal countries. These are your kind of definitive patrol craft. But we also have the Shinmaiwa US-2, that big blue guy down in the bottom right. Now, you probably have seen this aircraft in particular recently in at least a few different articles, not necessarily because of it, but because the U.S. is toying with the idea of making a large naval-based plane, or have a large plane that can take off from the water, right? I believe they're like KC-130s or C-130s they're trying to refit to do it, or maybe a smaller craft. I can't remember exactly. But I know I've seen a lot of articles be like, why doesn't the U.S. just buy this? And that's a whole nother conversation for another time. But these aircraft will most definitely do most of the heavy lifting. And then you have F-35Bs or the Air Force come in to do whatever else needs to be done if these can't accomplish their anti-shipping or anti-submarine missions. And that leaves us with the JSDF, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, with just under 50,000 personnel and just under 750 aircraft. The JSDF is separated into 4 separate commands, with the Northern, Central, Western, and Southwestern being those 4. Now, of course, not all the 750 aircraft are fighters, but still, air power of Japan is pretty much like the rest of the JSDF, and it punches well above its weight. Now, of course, a lot of that is due to its relation with the U.S. and its fairly impressive aerospace industry in and of itself. But I do have to say the artisanal side of things is very interesting as well. The JSDF has some of the best paint schemes, and their special ones, like the Cherry Blossom F-15 up there, just slap so hard. God, Japan, y'all just make, chef's kiss. It's great. Anyway, the regular blue camo that we see down there, or paint scheme on the F2, and as well as their gray variant of that, looks really, really nice. Now, I want you to take a second. Look at that F2. Does that not look like one of like the just best looking thing? Like, it's an F-16, but it's cooler, in my opinion. At least it's just great. I have an irrational attachment to the F2 for some reason. I don't know why. Anyway, the JSDF uses their derivative of the F-15, the F-15J, and their offshoot of the F-16 and the F-2 for most of their aerial combat missions. Now, I'll talk about the F-2 in another video, because it's like the hipster version of the F-16. I love it. It's great. But I'll leave the more detailed portions of that for that video. But sadly, this aircraft is being retired. The F-2s are slowly being replaced by other aircraft, whether it be F-35s or what is intended, the FX program that they're currently working on with other countries, with the UK and Italy, if I remember correctly. But they also operate AWACS and tanker fleets, so for a country its size, in terms of its land mass and population, it's actually pretty impressive air force overall. Now, generally speaking, the JSDF is somewhat of a homebody. Being largely focused on home defense, they don't really do a whole lot outside of that. Now, of course, they do participate in military exercises pretty regularly, whether that's aviation, whether that's their ground forces or their naval forces. They all kind of work there. And they've even had some units be part of other operations, but pretty much only in support roles. They don't see combat whenever they go out, because they're not an expeditionary military for the most part. So with all of that in mind, it shouldn't be shocking that they really just focus on their land and their regional waters. Now, being homebodies doesn't mean they can't show up when they're needed, but, it's their focus, right? It's not Taiwan by any means in terms of intercepting enemy aircraft, but the JSDF does scramble interceptions pretty regularly for either some Chinese intrusions, but a lot of times it's Russians. Part of this is location, as far as like where air bases in Russia are and kind of how the globe actually works. But it's also part that there's some land disputes between the Japanese and the Russians as well over the Kuril Islands that lay just off the northeast coast, or northern coast, sorry. Northeastern coast of Hokkaido. Now, a few talks have happened over the years in terms of these land disputes of the Kuril Islands, but nothing really solid has come from it. There are still kind of open claims on both sides. So it's not a settled deal. Now, if you want to talk about islands in some contested or at least some concerned perspectives, we travel just to the other side of the country, to the Senkaku Islands that lay off the southern coast, I guess, of Japan, only about 200 kilometers from Taiwan. These islands are not big population hubs. Most of them are not even populated, but the CCP has been eyeing them for a long time, wanting to use them either as stepping stones into the greater Pacific so they can break the first island chain, or just use it as a way to pressure Taiwan if they didn't want to fully invade the island. Now, of course, they'd have to invade Japanese islands, so not great idea either way, but regardless, these islands are pretty important and have been a real big key signifier that the Japanese, to an extent, have interest in the Taiwan situation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean if Taiwan gets invaded that Japan's really going to do anything, but they do have missile sites and stuff set up on the Senkaku Islands to help intercept missiles that maybe will fly away, or maybe have some issues, fly away from their intended target on Taiwan, and maybe end up by these islands. Hard to say, but regardless, having missile defense systems there, and if they happen to take out a couple missiles that are heading for Taiwan, so be it. Now, I do want to really stress that, 200 kilometers is not a lot. I'm American. I don't know what kilometers actually means. But I can't even leave my state in any direction from where I am in 200 kilometers, which is about 125 American miles for everybody else out there. That's not a lot. That's absurd. That is ridiculous. That is a very, very small distance. Now, I know we already said that the JSDF is a homebody. Now, unless, of course, a portal to a fantasy realm opens up, then maybe they can go around beyond their borders, because, it's anime. But, gate reference for all you weebs out there. Anyway, the one capability they usually exercise in terms of going beyond their regional waters is their navy. They're punching well above their weight in terms of a blue water navy, and one of the few countries that isn't the US, China, or Russia that has a fairly large blue water navy. Now, I really can't go through this without addressing an oddly shaped German elephant in the room, so here it goes. Imperial Japan is a lot of reason why. Imperial Japan was a bunch of dicks, and they did a bunch of really bad things. They really get overshadowed by the Germans, but they did probably worse in a lot of ways in terms of general populations and in terms of overall death and atrocities. So a lot of countries in the region, of course, not big fans of the Japanese. It's been, 60 years, 70 years, more 80 years. It's been a long time since World War II, but still, this is something that does play a big part in regional politics. And it plays a big part in why Japan is a self-defense force. The JSDF is not out here trying to be like, hey, can we put a base on your country? Because they kind of know the answer. Now, modern Japan is not Imperial Japan by any means. They're polar opposites in many, many, many respects. But just like with German aid to Ukraine, there's a lot of historical baggage there that we as Americans don't get. We're really kind of the live and let live types when we look at geopolitical topics. If we really look at one of the most controversial modern wars for the U.S., we're looking at the Vietnam War, which sure feels kind of like a distant memory, but it's the last big war we were in, save for Iraq and Afghanistan, where we fought a more organized enemy. And yeah, we're like, whatever, we still do a lot of trade with you, Vietnam, so we're pretty cool with you. We got some history, but it's water under the bridge. And Vietnam is still communist Vietnam. This is the people that we were fighting. But we're like, nah, it's fine. Don't worry. Let's get some trade going. So yeah, the U.S., even looking like further back, is pretty like, hey, just we're not gonna like crush you economically speaking. Like, yeah, we did some damage, we did some dirt, but it's been 10, 15 years on. Let's start looking at trade deals. In short, this is largely because we don't really have any kind of like invasions, right? So we don't really get it. But memories are long in countries where they were invaded and war crimes were committed, massacres were committed. So very reasonable that not only from an internal perspective, the Japan Self-Defense Force wants to stay in Japan largely, but in the region, there's not a lot of interest for having a Japanese military force in around your country for an extended period of time. So they don't really have any forward bases to speak of, but they are, in a lot of ways, in alliances with a fair few of these countries, usually via the U.S. So I mentioned earlier that Japan's waters are some of the most contentious in the world, largely because the CCP's growing naval power, Russia's kind of aging, vaguely existent naval power, and of course North Korea's hate for the ocean. I think it's safe to say that the Kims are in a grudge match with Poseidon, and Poseidon's still winning. I really wanted to find a graphic from like the Greeks or the Romans fighting the water. It's like throwing spears into the sea, but I couldn't find it, and I'm really sad about that. But yeah, it's the same thing. History repeats itself. Needless to say, for a country that isn't the U.S., this is pretty scary. Like, you're close to a lot of powerful people that don't really get along with you super well. Now, this is also something we have to take in the context that the modern Japanese populace have known nothing but pacifism. They've not been in a war situation since World War II, right? Now, they've been around a lot of contentious things, but they've not directly dealt with it. Now, if we partner this with their demographic problems, it can feel like the walls are closing in a little bit. If you don't have a large populace and you don't really go out and do any things and you have these very powerful neighbors, the threat of trade routes and invasions are a concern that they want to be prepared for, but they don't really want to go out and be proactive for, all of the reasons I've stated already. But it's safe to say that even with all of these problems, Japan's been preparing for invasions for centuries. Like, they have a history of being invaded, both successfully and not successfully. So this is just another blip in a long line of hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. And that leads me to the end here, my personal thoughts. And this is where I get to talk about Article 9, so get ready. Article 9 has had a lot of interpretations over the years, and effectively, for anyone who's unaware of what Article 9 is, basically this is the part of the Japanese Constitution that was drafted after World War II that said Japan cannot have a military. Now, it has, as I've said, gone through a lot of different interpretations to get to the modern JSDF. Now, some of that view comes from the public, some of that view comes from the government. There's kind of middle grounds there. If you've seen anything outside of the assassination of Shinzo Abe, about Shinzo Abe, this is one of the big things for him, was reinterpreting what Article 9 meant, expanding Japanese military capabilities, and of course also trying to combat their demographic problems. But there is an interesting conversation that happens around this because you don't have a lot of other countries that fall into this. Like, the Swiss are kind of the only other ones, but they also are pretty much surrounded by allies, so that's not a big deal, or people who are friendly to them at the very least. So for Japan to have this limitation but still be as powerful as they are, or at least have the capability of being as powerful as they are, is very interesting to me. Now, Some have called for removing Article 9. Some have called for reinterpreting it. And, some don't even really specifically call for it, but just kind of do actions that really insist upon a different view of Article 9. So it is kind of a hard barrier, but at the same time, there's a lot of ways to work around it, as we've seen with the Kaga and Azumo being refit to be carriers effectively, at least light carriers, and then having the rapid deployment forces or rapid response forces that operate in a very amphibious, expeditionary way, which is not fairly consistent with the rest of the JSDF. Now, putting all that in the context of NATO and the non-NATO allies and kind of Western relations in general, Japan did just host, I want to say, one of the NATO summits fairly recently. And they're a big player as far as like the G7 and everything. So they have a lot of very close ties to the U.S. And while there's been contention, whether it's the F2 program or stealth technology or the bases in Japan, we're on really good terms with the Japanese in terms of at least military technology and sharing it aside from the F2. But you also have Australia, which has pretty good relations with NATO or with Japan, as well as kind of New Zealand by proxy in a way. But, as far as regional powers, Australia and New Zealand don't have as much of that kind of negative context or connotation or history with Japan that a lot of other countries that are closer, say the Koreas or the Philippines to an extent, or China, would have, right? So for Japan, a lot of those countries, it's much more of the enemy of my enemy is a friend versus like an actual allied situation. But with time, that perspective, that viewpoint has lessened, right? Nobody's out here saying, oh yeah, Japan's the best in those countries, but they have gotten warmer, at least. And then, like I said, in the larger scheme of things, Japan's not going to be joining NATO by any means, but being able to work within that framework, within that context, within kind of the U.S. and the other non-NATO allies, is important, right? Having that relationship, whether you're looking at combating China's growing influence or Russia or North Korea in this probably more particular instance, is really important. And lastly, most definitely not least, spending, development, and cooperation between different countries, whether it's the UK and Italy for the FX program or the US for the F-15Js, the F-2, the Aegis combat system, so on and so forth. Japan is a real oddity, right? Because there's a lot of countries that are similar to Japan in terms of its population, in terms of its GDP, that don't have like a thriving aerospace industry by any means, right? Whereas Japan still does to an extent. Of course, they're not out here busting out F-35s, but being able to really contribute to the FX program is wild, right? And they even had kind of their own test demonstrator, stealth fighter, the X2 is what it was. And of course, much like the KF-21, it looked very similar to an F-22. But there are a lot of things I think people just kind of don't think about for Japan, largely because they've been so insular. There are a lot of really interesting developments that have come out of Japan, whether it's working in the shipbuilding industries, with their Taigai class submarines, or like looking at the F2, even if you go back a ways, and how they made it bigger but lighter than the F-16 at the time. Very wild. So there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of expertise that exists in Japan that hasn't been able to been exported, and now the Japanese are kind of getting to that point where they're saying, hey, Maybe we'll look at exports. Maybe we'll look at trying to sell older things. We're not going to make planes purely for export, but if we have them, we'll consider it at the very least. And that's a pretty big deal if you're looking at warming relations and really cooperating from a technological standpoint with a lot of your neighbors. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the JSDF as far as like the 1,000-foot overview, giving you a basis for at least most of it. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. I'll do my best to answer them. And if you have thoughts on the JSDF, let me know. Outside of that, thanks for sticking with me for about a half hour. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one.